is crucial to examine the state of democracy in Africa, highlighting the progress made, as well as the challenges that still persist. It is within this context that the Future of Diplomacy Research Group at the University of Johannesburg's Institute for the Future of Knowledge has organized this event titled Democracy and Development in Africa. How far? How well? My name is Oluwaseun Teller, Head of the Future of Diplomacy at the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. And on behalf of the Institute, I would like to extend my warm African welcome to our distinguished guest. Sambonani, Jumelang, Masikati Akanaka, Unakaribishwa, Ekabo. It is my pleasure to note that in our midst, we have representatives from the French Embassy. Today, we have assembled a panel of distinguished speakers who will engage the successes and challenges of democratic consolidation as well as sustainable development in Africa. Chairing today's event is Professor Victoria Graham, Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives and Administration at the University of Johannesburg. Interestingly, I had the privilege of encountering Professor Victoria Graham at an African Day event organized by the Faculty of Humanities last year. We shared pleasantries, and after about 5 minutes, I noticed that she had a different dress. And of course, I was I was amazed, only to realize that I had mistaken her for her identical twin, Professor Susie Graham, who is also a professor here at UJ. And here is the moment we have been waiting for. Professor Susie Graham, I beg your pardon, Professor Victoria Graham, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Dr. Teller. I can't ever live that down. She's like a barnacle on my side, my twin. But anyway, thank you so much. Greetings to everyone here in the UJ Library, as well as all of those, of course, joining us online. And thank you for being in attendance in what promises to be an excellent seminar on the progress and stumbling blocks of democracy and development. Head of the Future of Diplomacy Unit at IFK here at the great University of Johannesburg for arranging this important event at this most significant of times. South Africa's 30th year of democracy and elections right around the corner. Now, I was asked to say a few words on democracy and development in Africa by way of an introduction to today's event. But this was a dangerous request because my field is in quality of democracy studies, and I could speak for hours on end about this. But I promised Dr. Teller that I've limited my remarks to 5 minutes, and I timed myself. So I'm hoping I stick to that and let the real honored guests and experts for today's event actually take over and speak. So just a few comments then about democracy and development. Now, the relationship between democracy and development in Africa, as we all know, is complex and multifaceted. There's diversity there in terms of the politics, the economics, and social landscapes, of course. And while several African countries have experienced rapid economic growth in recent decades, poverty and inequality remain pervasive throughout the continent. Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, has the highest rates of extreme poverty globally. Throughout the wave of democratization in the late 80s and early 90s, many African countries transitioned to multi-party democracies. But since then, we have seen in practice a profusion of ambiguous situations, whereby many African countries maintain democratic facades while practicing authoritarianism. Regular elections might have become more common, but their quality and fairness varies. Democratic institutions such as independent judiciaries and legislatures are stronger in some countries than in others. Corruption is a significant issue. It impedes effective governance in many countries and erodes public trust, which is one of the most important things in a democratic state. One of the challenges relating to the concept of democracy is, of course, defining the concept itself. Because as we know, any kind of definition work is a tricky road to go down. Everyone will see definitions in their own way and define concepts in their own way. So it's about perspective. And democracy is one of the most difficult concepts to define, since we know there are over 500 definitions that exist on paper in literature. So it's so hard to define democracy. And that then has implications for, implementation in practice. Because if you don't know what it means, how do you know how to measure its practice? So that's a concern in a complex situation. There have also been long debates about whether or not democracy in Africa is actually an alien form of government that's derived from Western political experience. After all, much attention has been paid to where the word democracy itself comes from, ancient Greece. I'm sure you all know that. We have a lot of political historians that attribute democratic values to the English, American, and French revolutions. The Magna Carta, signed by King John in England in 1215, is widely considered as one of the most important documents legally in terms of the development of modern democracy. But little is said about Africa's democracy and development. What about the Mandan Charter? That was also signed, I want to say orally, in air quotes, in around the 1200s, same time as the Magna Carta. But you don't really hear about the Mandan Charter, and that was on our continent. One of the oldest constitutions in the world, albeit mainly in oral form, okay, but it contains a preamble of several chapters advocating for social peace and diversity, education, the integrity of the motherland, food security, abolition of slavery, etc., and the list goes on. Another complexity revolves around this tension that exists between valuing democracy as a normative good in and of itself and wanting democracy to deliver on social goods. So supporters of this latter view argue that the democratic principles of participation and political equality are basically meaningless unless individuals have adequate resources to meet their basic social needs. Zainab Bangura noted that human freedom and human dignity are like the two pedals of a bicycle. One cannot move without the other. And also importantly, the more economically independent people are, the easier it is for them to make independent political decisions. So all of these are complex realities, and this is just scratching the surface of this complexity. So hopefully our speakers here today can help us to wade through this quagmire. Each speaker will have 15 minutes each to speak, and this will be followed by a Q&A, which is possibly the most important part of today's seminar session, where we get to hear what you think. We can answer questions. So I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, who is actually a former colleague of mine, so it's very nice to be in touch again, Professor Lawrence Hamilton, who's the South Africa-UK Bilateral Research Chair in Political Theory at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. So I'm going to hand over to Prof. Hamilton now, who is online and who'll have 15 minutes to share his thoughts on this topic.
Good afternoon, all. Many thanks for that lovely introduction and for the invitation by the IFK and UJ, particularly by Dr. Teller and Tandega. Not sure I'm going to use up my full 15 minutes, but do feel free to give me an indication 2 minutes out in case I get carried away. I live and work in 2 countries. This is not out of choice, really. It's to do with the chair that I hold. South Africa and the UK. And the most striking thing about doing so brings out a disturbing problem about development in South Africa. Excuse the focus on South Africa. It's mainly to do with the fact that that's my main area of empirical focus. I'm mainly a political theorist, but I also work in South Africa. So more on this, what this life brings out, as it were. In the UK, besides the understandable obsession around AI, which is also true of South Africa and Africa, 2 of the most important topics of discussion and policy analysis are degrowth and climate change, or the climate crisis that we're facing. In the interest of time, and due to the fact that I'm not interested in allowing these northern discourses to dictate our agenda, I leave a description of these to one side today, but I'm sure you all know what I mean by these. In sum, even if these dominant ideas are not clear policy yet, there is obviously policy existing and there's policy coming out, they will become so. They are or will become chosen implementable areas of maintaining development. understood as maintaining quality of life. In South Africa, by contrast, and many other parts of Africa, the same concerns and priorities obtain, although there is understandably less emphasis on the argument around degrowth. But in our case, in South Africa's case, sustainability has not been a development choice. It has been a consequence of what you might call de-development, poorly maintained, failing infrastructure, etc., leading to the lack of provision of the basics for growth. Power supply jumps out at us, of course. The privatization of possible solutions that have inadvertently led to focus on climate change, private sector provision of solar paneling in response to our energy crisis, for example. This is one of the things that the government has made clear recently, that private sector response to load shedding has provided quite a lot of energy provision, and that is a private sector response. So South Africa is developing towards sustainable quality of life, but not due to development choices, or at least not due to the kind of intentional development choices that you might expect, say, or that I'm seeing in, say, the UK, where, of course, there are choices around maintaining development or maintaining sustainable development. But rather, these are a consequence of failures. Failures around a whole series of areas that I'll get to in a second. And moreover, where there have been successes, they've been for the few and not the many. So on the one side, you have development or de-development as a consequence not of developmental choices, and where you have had some success, they have not been rolled out in a way in which the majority get to feel the outcomes of these development choices. So a few statistics, I don't want to bore you, but a few statistics that I'm sure a lot of you will have come across before and know quite well. Notwithstanding success stories around poverty reduction and the provision of housing in SA over the last 30 years, there are unfortunately many poor outcomes, at least if we reduce the picture to the last 10 years or so. South Africa's formal unemployment rate, not to speak of its real unemployment rate, hovers around a third of the population. This is clearly unsustainable. Second, South Africa has the highest levels of inequality on the planet. Again, unsustainable. Third, it has a murder rate of 45 out of every 100,000 persons, significantly higher than both Colombia and Mexico. Most definitely unsustainable. Fourth, our well-known scheduled load shedding. We know all about that, and its deleterious effects on lives, livelihoods, jobs, and businesses. We've had a respite recently, as you all know, but who knows the real reason for that? Unsustainable again. Fifth, South Africa is only one of a handful of countries, along with the UK, that is significantly poorer than it was a decade ago. Its GDP per capita has gone down from $8,800 in 2012 to $6,190 in 2023. If you're interested in some of these points, particularly around a comparison between what you can find in Stats SA, for example, for 2023 and 2024, and compared to, say, 2012, 2013, my book published in 2014, Are South Africans Free?, lays out quite a lot of this, around all of those different components. And sixth, and finally, an incredible 47% of South Africans rely on social grants for their primary income. So in sum, we are not growing, or we are growing very slightly, which would probably satisfy many degrowth proponents for reasons related to climate change, etc. But this degrowth is not of our own choice. we're not choosing to not grow. We are successfully in some ways transitioning to green energy, but not again out of choice. We are doing so due to a different kind of necessity than that felt in the developed North. Not positive moves to industrialize towards the green economy, for example, but mostly because we have no other choice. In other words, the government provision of energy, say, in this regard, as regards green energy, is failing and is providing so many difficulties that out of necessity, the private sector and even individuals have resorted to solar energy to the extent that they have. This is not development, but de-development. The last statistic I just mentioned regarding welfare grants points to the economic disasters of the past 2 decades, I'd say, but also the successes of the government's welfare program. However, taxing and borrowing from a small and shrinking minority to meet the basic needs of such a large portion of the population in this way may be vital for the satisfaction of very basic needs and for the continuation of basic livelihoods, but it is not a sustainable model for development. The creation of jobs, effective health provision, infrastructure upkeep, etc., are what is necessary. But those, in a way, are means towards development. And I just want to make a little distinction here that I hope may be helpful in the discussion. Development understood as simply meeting basic needs by any means is not sustainable development. So to get around this problem, it's necessary to see development through a different sort of lens, a lens about improving quality of life for all, enabling choice, and enlarging freedoms. As the famous economist, philosopher, and doyen of development, Amartya Sen, put it, development is, and I quote, a process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy. That's from his Development is Freedom. GDP growth, maximization of personal incomes, industrialization, technological advance, social modernization, etc., may all be important means to this end. But the real end that we ought to have in focus is freedom, or freedom as power, or as he understands it, capability or the capacity to live a certain kind of life. Ultimately, the quality of life of all individuals. So for him, it makes sense, even though those components of development are important, and they're obviously the kinds of things that are central to policy formation in democracies, or democracies that at least would like to remain democracies, and for governments who'd like to remain in power. It makes sense for someone like, it makes sense, Sen argues, to focus not so much on these means when we think about development, but to think about the ends, and to think about the ends and get them clear, and then move on to what means might be the best solution for reaching those ends. And he doesn't say this very much, but I would add, that's always a contextual matter. So the means, if you want the more technical components of that question, are always going to be different in different places, depending on where you're starting from, what your challenges are. And so that process is going to be a contextual process of determining which means will get you to the ends that we value in development. And basically, why are we developing it in this way? We get that clear, and then in context, we work out the policies that will get us to those ends. I just want to say two further things around a capable state and why that's so important for this, and then just end off on elections, because obviously that's at the forefront of our minds currently in South Africa. So in order for you to focus on these ends and to then get a clear picture of what means are required to attain these ends, you need, mainly because they involve things like the maintenance and construction of large infrastructure projects, they require things like energy provision, all of the things I've spoken about earlier. They also involve the creation of a functioning welfare state like South Africa is trying to do. A capable functioning state is a sine qua non of this. This cannot be undertaken without a capable functioning state. And as we all know, at least in South Africa, since the start of the Zuma period, the functionality, the capability of our state has been undermined very, very significantly. That's not really the topic of today, so I'm going to leave that to one side. But the question, I suppose, the burning question for me and for many South Africans when they go to the polls is, are these elections going to change anything? In short, I'm sad to say, and I'm sorry to sound so pessimistic, but I doubt it. And the reason for that is it's quite simple. Even though there's been a lot of talk about the ANC losing its 50% majority, and that's, in my view, very likely, I don't think the contenders and their electoral tallies will necessarily change very much in the coalition, in the outcome of the elections, and in the coalition dynamics that follow. For example, the DA is likely to get approximately 20%. I think the EFF will get approximately 13, 14% is a rough guess. And so those will be the main players in the coalition negotiations, and then in the governmental structures, the governmental decision makings, etc., that follow. And the Democratic Alliance is not a party that is really interested in development as I've described it. So I don't think we're going to get much out of the Democratic Alliance along those lines. And the EFF is unfortunately just too militant and populist to really think about these things in these terms. And you've got also, besides this, a lot of smaller parties that, if you think about it, are basically trying to accrue voter support along what you might call ethno-nationalist lines. So MK springs to mind, the Patriotic Front, etc. Those are parties that are trying to fill a gap, not by promising development of the kind that I've described, but by appealing to people's fears along ethno-nationalist lines. What we desperately need then to generate a capable state, to generate the development that we need, and to generate real freedom-enhancing choice in South Africa, is a credible party on the left of the ANC, which we don't have. Many thanks. That's all for me.
Thank you so much, Prof. Hamilton, for those thought-provoking statements to start us off for the day. I think we'll get to this in Q&A, so we'll park it for this a minute. So I'll introduce Nkoshi, who's up next. Distinguished Professor at the Wits School of Governance, please come and share your pearls of wisdom with us. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much indeed, and happy Africa Day to all of us. And as Prof. Hamilton was closing on his forecast and reflecting on our host today, your work on futures, I was reminded of Wole Soyinka's piece, which was written against the backdrop of the growing popularity, which I think is becoming Pan-African now, of prophets and prophecies on all matters concerning us on the African continent. It's a huge industry in Nigeria, where I come from. And I know that in these parts also, the likes of Bushiri, the likes of Obed from Zimbabwe and others are busy every day churning out prophecies about what the future holds for us on the African continent. We forecast things about the outcome of Arsenal versus Man City, who will win between Mugabe and Joyce Julu, and so on and so forth. And out of frustration, Wole Soyinka wrote this short critique, which he titled Requiem for the Futurologist, and basically tabulating a lot of the failed predictions that some of the prophets have basically introduced in discourses on the continent in a way that actually is not completely innocent, because it does carry consequences for action or inaction. If you believe your prophet that a particular outcome is going to be what you will get in an election season, depending on where you stand, you are likely to choose to vote or not vote, depending on what that prophet says. But in most cases, the criticism of the demobilizing consequence of most of the political prophecies, as I call them, has been an understudied aspect of our experience of democratic governance on this continent over the last 30 years. And as much as the quest for democratization was itself an important social movement when it began in the 1990s, Benin Republic, a small country in West Africa, where people were on the streets for 6 months, where they themselves removed the government by organized street power, where they convened a sovereign national conference of their own, rewrote the constitution, and set up what they hoped would be a second liberation for the country. I think a lot of us had very high hopes that Africa, in fact, Colin Legoum, who was based here for a long time, being a commentator on the African scene for the period since independence to the 1990s, described that moment of the 1990s as the second liberation for the African continent. I think looking back 30 years on almost of that transition, which coincides also with the 30th anniversary of South Africa's freedom, it is not too difficult to see the many deficits. And I would concur with our moderator and Prof. Hamilton on the broad conclusions which you have drawn. It's not difficult to see the many things which Hamilton just spoke about, but which I think can be expanded much more broadly to describe the situation in which most of Africa finds itself, in which amongst the competing political parties, and regardless from experience of who comes to power, as they say in French, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it appears to change, the more it remains the same. In fact, colleagues in the DRC say that it is worse than that. It is not so much that plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, but that actually the more it changes, the worse it seems to get. Because you look at the person who was voted out of power in the previous cycle, and you think you can't sink lower than that. And then the next person who comes in actually shows you that there are more records of decline to be beaten. And that creates a situation of alienation and apathy, such as we have seen in recent years, especially where young democracies, so-called, on the African continent are having levels of voter turnout that are as pathetic as those of the United States or parts of Europe that are described as the more mature democracies, where people could say that they have seen it all in the course of their lifetime. And I think this choicelessness is partly one of the elements which we need to develop and understand a bit much more. Why is it that in spite of the alternation of power between opposition parties and ruling parties, erstwhile opposition figures being voted into power, replacing incumbents who have disappointed public hopes and opinion. Why is it that they do not perform differently or better than those whom they replace? And why is it that even when change takes place, and that's not really the main issue in debate today on the continent, elections, as has been said, have become routinized. Why is it that we do not see any qualitative shift in the quality, in the type of governance that is proposed to the populace? And my response to that is basically that on the policy side, we are locked in a situation in which, regardless of which government comes to power, the core economic and social policies have been defined. Manifestos may look beautiful, but it does not matter. So I can actually say to you that even if a populist party were to come to power in South Africa, it will not be a long time before you realize that unless they repudiate the broad policy framework that is imposed by a transnational power project on our countries, we are not going anywhere. And basically, to break it down, we have moved from a situation in which, prior to the reform of the 1990s, concentration of power was largely in the presidencies. And that's what Peter Ayang-Yongo and others called presidentialism in African politics, and published a book about it. And others have also written about the way in which the concentration and centralization of power around charismatic or not so charismatic authoritarian figures has been a problem for the continent. In the multi-party framework of the 90s and beyond that we have seen, what we have actually witnessed has been a shifting of key levels of economic decision-making and social policy direction to the ministries of finance and the central banks. And the structure of accountability is not so much to the commons, but to the Bretton Woods institutions, in which your finance minister agrees a medium-term expenditure framework, and your central bank asserts a certain independence that their duty is to fight inflation, right? Yeah. The number one objective of central banks within a neoliberal world is inflation target. And regardless of whether you have 40% unemployment or 60% unemployment, there is a cap on the public expenditure, which is why, interestingly, countries of the continent that are described as the most youthful in the world, with levels of unemployment up to 60% among young people, cannot implement growth-stimulating policies of a macroeconomic kind. Because, of course, you are inflation targeted most of the time. And the consequence of it is exactly what we have harvested, a disconnection between democratic governance and politics of the type that is being attempted and the direction of economic policy. Lisa Laxo, who studied Zimbabwe for many years, actually summarized this by saying that in the end, by the dawn of the new millennium, with a period of at least 10 years of voting experience behind us, we have entered a situation, you know, Lisa Laxo, she's interviewed you many times for our work, says that what we are actually reduced to is voting without choosing. You are allowed to vote, but you really do not exercise choice at the end of the day, because the answers are already pre-cooked and predetermined for you. And I think this disconnection between development and democracy is not really something which we should treat as simply an academic exercise. Because after all, as people, we carry experiences with us forward in order to make certain choices in life. Where you started your journey from, for a lot of Africans, was a context of post-independence authoritarianism, where you knew live presidents, where you knew people who concentrated power, where you had an absence of pluralism of any kind. Media houses and the like were all owned by the government. A single party regime was in place for a lot of countries. And however benign presidents may have been, the truth of the matter was that the environment was one of political monopoly. And a political monopoly which did not live up to its promise of delivering development. Because after all, the justification for the imposition of single-party regimes was that we needed to catch up with regard to development. That was the justification. 30 years on from independence in the mid-1950s, we were still trying to catch up. And in the meantime, the gap was opening between us and the rest of the world. Now, come into the 1990s, I think it was completely legitimate for people to expect that if authoritarian governance has failed to deliver development, hopefully, elected government in a plural system should deliver development. Well, at the dawn of the new millennium, there was a lot of talk about Africa rising, right? Africa rising. Just look at the indicators of rising Africa that were used by the likes of McKinsey and others to try to capture what they called the time of Africa. One of those indicators was that the middle class of Lagos, the economic hub of Nigeria, was now consuming more champagne than all of France. But not looking at the fact that in the midst of all of that consumption habit, there was also massive poverty that has made Nigeria the single most important hub for poor people in the world today. And this is the kind of thing which basically has led the populace to ask, when will the dividends of democracy be delivered? Because we expected and we were promised that if we got rid of authoritarian government, certain things will follow. 20 years, 30 years on, all we see is that the politicians are getting richer and fatter, and the rest of the population is getting poorer. As in a country like DRC, a member of parliament is able to take home $32,000 a month in DRC. In the same vein in which the president of that country will go abroad to go and ask for a loan of $5 million. Nigerian members of parliament are easily amongst the highest paid in the world. Nobody can tell you exactly how much they take because they pass the budget, but at least we know, and a senator of the republic made it public recently and is on suspension for going public. He's on suspension by his colleagues, unanimous. No difference among political parties there. They all agreed to suspend and bury their differences for revealing their secret. And he indicated that a budget of a certain amount was proposed by the executive. This budget was padded by the Senate and the House of Reps by almost 1/3. Right? Sheung, am I wrong? 1/3. 1/3. Adding trillions onto the budget. And those trillions were to go to projects that had no head or tail. A senator, in his conscience, saying that this cannot be right. How do we monitor those kinds of things? These are things that will go to the individual senators. After collecting 200 million as palliatives on the hard times post-COVID for their Christmas entertainment. And at the end of the day, people are looking at these situations and they are saying, actually, when will this democracy finish? And it is partly what explains why you find in some parts of the continent that coups have been welcomed by the populace. And for those that have not had coups, the harsh reaction to the coup makers is not because of their attachment to democracy. It's a warning to their military not to try to remove them, because they know that if there is any popular movement that is organized and strong enough, either within the armed forces or the populace, the streets will be filled with jubilating members of the public about the end of a charade. And so we are actually faced with a situation in which we are compelled, I believe, to step back and seriously rethink what we mean by democracy and seriously rethink what we mean by development. What is the bargain in the system of governance that we put in place for the citizens like you and me? What is the reciprocal responsibility of the governance institutions and the citizenry? And what do we want in terms of a future for ourselves, looking 50 years down the road? If we are able to answer that question, perhaps we'll be able to define democracy and define development according to our circumstances.
Thank you so much, Prof. Some stark truths sharing with us there. It's real rock star comments going on there. Thank you. I've actually got several questions for you myself before we get to that point, Q&A. But I would like to just take this moment to recognize some representatives from the Spanish embassy who are with us here to share in the discussion with us today. So thank you for being here, colleagues. And then I'd like to hand over now to our final speaker for today before the Q&A, Professor Arthur Mutumbara.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of interesting points have been made, and I'll try not to be repetitive. Democracy and development in Africa, how far, how well? My presentation is structured in 3 parts, 3 sections. The first section says, we must delink democracy from development for us to, for analysis purposes. Just delink them. That's my first contribution. The second one is to say, we know a lot about the requirements of democracy, but we don't spend enough time on the requirements and the elements and drivers of development. So my second section will be concentrated on how do we get development done. Then the last section of my presentation will be, what have been some successes on the continent in South Africa, so that we can end on a happy note. We want development, we want democracy. I think the phrasing goes something like, we must aspire to get a capable democratic developmental state. That's the slogan, right? Capable democratic developmental state. How do you get there? You must delink them. Why do you want to delink them? Because there are countries that have development without democracy. There are counterexamples. What we learn from those? So I'm delinking now. When I say China, China is not a democratic country according to most definitions. According to the Americans and Westerners, they're a communist country without democracy. But they're the second biggest economy in the world, and they're going to overtake America. So what is it? Oh, by the way, we must have democracy. We must have development. But for us to get those two, we must delink them and look at the drivers of development. What is it that the Chinese are doing without democracy to get development going? If we understand those elements, then we can say, yeah, these are the drivers of democracy. Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew was not your traditional democracy, but Singapore was able to move, Lee Kuan Yew was able to move in 30 years from third world so-called country to a first world. What did he do in Singapore without your traditional democracy? Malaysia, the same. Rwanda is doing very well. It's not exactly your democracy. There's some democracy there, but some people object to Kagame staying forever. But Rwanda is doing well. What are they doing without democracy? We must delink democracy from development in order to understand how we get them. Because they're counterexamples. where people have achieved development without your traditional setup of democracy. There are also counterexamples the other way. Lots of democracy, lots of and very little development. This country, you're going to an election in this country, where's the development? We've had good elections, 1994. You know, they're not rigged. They're hopefully free and fair. They might rig them this time around, but so far they've been okay. Mandela came and went, back and went, Zuma. So we've had renewal within the ANC, which is good because we don't have it in other places. We've lots of parties, the DA, the EFF, now with MK. So you could say by some definition or measure of democracy, South Africa is doing very well on the democracy piece. But this country has the worst inequality in the world in terms of the Gini coefficient. So what's going on? We seem to have the democracy thing sorted, but the development one, we need to understand the drivers of development. Botswana has been fairly reasonable in its democracy, but there's lots of natural resources, but are they a rock star state in terms of the economy? Not necessarily, but the democracy is fairly okay. I am suggesting that for us to be able to get democracy and development, we must understand the drivers. I won't spend much time on the drivers of democracy because you understand them very well. The Westerners have taught you. They talk to you about, but funny things, they don't tell you about development, they talk about democracy. I'll give you just an illustration to show you the folly of thinking democracy means development. Let's have a family here of 4. These 4 families, family number 1, family number 2, family number 3, 4. They form a country, these 4 families here. And they've a collective, resource base of 10,000 rands. For them to survive for a year, they need 2 million rands. Okay? This family, this country of 4 families, they have 10,000 rands. They need 2 million rands to survive this year. Of course, they must discuss how we're going to lead our country of 4 families. We must have transparency. We must have accountability. There must be no corruption. We must have free and fair elections among the 4 of us. If that is all they talk about, these 4 families, transparency, lack of corruption, free and fair elections, if they don't talk about that, how they're going to move from 10,000 rands to 2 million rands, they will have a problem. It's not enough for this family of 4 to discuss fairness, to discuss democracy. They must also have a conversation about the transformation from 10,000 rands to 2 million. That's missing in most of our conversations. So democracy is important, but it is what we call in mathematics, a necessary but not sufficient condition. Of course, this family must be fair, they must be democratic, there must be accountability, there must be transparency. Transparency about 10,000 rands. Accountability about 10,000 is important, but not enough. If they don't address the transformation from 10,000 rands to 2 million rands, they'll be dead by the end of the year. From the 10,000 rands, they must find their accommodation, their transport, their food, education for their kids. If they don't address that agenda, they will not survive. And yet they have democracy. We must delink the conversation about democracy and development so we can get the two. What are the key drivers of development? What should this family address around development? Number 1, a national economic vision which is shared. A national economic strategy which is shared. A national plan. They must have a plan. We spend a lot of time discussing politics, transparency, not enough time on where do we want South Africa to be in the year 2060 from the year 2023, the economic vision of South Africa, and then the economic strategy of South Africa. By the way, it must be shared, not just an ANC RDP, not ANC 2030 vision. No, we must have in this country a national vision shared between the MK, EFF, the DA, IFP, and the ANC. In the same way, we share the same constitution. The EFF defends the constitution. I hope they do. The DA defends the constitution when they go to court. We are sharing a national constitution. We are sharing the boundaries of this country. Why can't we share a national economic vision and maybe differ on how to get there? Why don't we craft a national economic vision for South Africa, a national economic strategy which is shared across the board? We're not doing that. And those are the drivers of development. A national brand which is shared by all South Africans, a national brand in Malawi, a national vision in Malawi shared by all Malawians. You know why? Because when you look at the Chinese, they have a 100-year plan. They have an economic vision, an economic plan. Lee Kuan Yew, without democracy, had an economic vision, an economic plan. Kagame does have an economic vision and a plan without your traditional democracy. So what we're saying is yes to sorting out democracy and getting it right, but we must separately discuss the components of the developmental agenda. What will drive development? A national economic vision, a national economic strategy, a national brand is a national plan. Second item that drives development, it has already been alluded to, a capable state. There's no point in democracy when your state is not capable. Why don't you? And Kagame has a capable state. The Chinese have a capable state. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore had a capable state. So having a capable state is not necessarily a function of democracy. You must consciously build a capable state. Without a capable state, without a capable infrastructure, this family of four won't make it to 2 million rands. Tied into capable state is competent leadership. Are you competent to lead this family of 4 to 2 million? Democracy does not necessarily deliver competent people. The Chinese leaders just go and Google or use ChatGPT to find out what is called in China the Standing Committee of the Politburo. Look at their resume. I'm not biased because I'm an engineer. They're engineers, electrical engineer, civil engineer, economy. So China, in their own perverted way, without democracy, allow their best minds to run China. You don't become a member of the Communist Party if you are a dum-dum, if you're a fool, if you're mediocre. You allow mediocrity to run your countries and you expect miracles. You allow below average chaps to run your countries, and someone through democracy, you won't arrive. The Chinese, and I'm not saying go the Chinese way, learn about competence of leadership from the Chinese and get the competence leadership your own way, but acknowledge that when you say Xi Jinping, that guy is an engineer with a solid record. When you look at those 9 men, there should be more women, but there's 9 men for now. So in addition to other things that are going well for China, they've allowed their best minds to run China. How are we allowing our best minds to run South Africa, to run Malawi, to run the African economies? Use your own ways to get competent leadership. Use your own ways to get a capable state. We need that. Lee Kuan Yew was a PhD in law from Cambridge. Mahathir, a medical doctor. So when you say the Singaporean story, it was directed by a PhD from Cambridge who was very smart and not exactly very democratic. The same applies to Mahathir as a doctor. Sleek when he says it, I wasn't very friendly to the opposition. Sometimes I had to hit them. But we have the Singaporean story. Kagame is making things happen. So, vision, capable state. Number 3, technology. Technology. Let us use technology to drive our economies. Not only technology, moving up the value chain so that we beneficiate our products. We don't sell raw platinum, raw lithium, we sell batteries. We sell catalytic converters. We sell cars to ourselves and to the region. Technology, technology, technology. We are talking about the drivers of development. Now with AI, why don't you use AI to drive agriculture, to drive mining, to drive infrastructure, to solve load shedding? These are the ideas outside democracy that we should think about, because the Chinese are using them without democracy. That's why I'm trying to isolate here. So technology is your friend. Technology should be a key driver of the development we want. The last driver I want to emphasize is scale. One of the secret weapons of the Chinese system is 1.4 billion Chinese. India, 1.3 billion Indians. Can you imagine when you do one product in China, you have a market for a billion people? How can you fail? And come to Africa, where are we? 2 million people. Botswana, I'm a country. Zimbabwe, 15 million people. You are not a country, you are a little village. We must talk about SADC, 300 million people. The continent of Africa, 1.4 billion Africans. Once we talk scale, we can get development. Can you imagine if I was to rock up and say, here come, I'm the African. I speak on behalf of 1.4 billion Africans. I have all these diamonds, copper, lithium, oil behind me from the continent of Africa. The Chinese will listen to you out of economics, not out of love. Also, when I negotiate on behalf of 1.4 billion people, I get a better deal from the Chinese, from the Americans, and from the Indians. When I rock up as Botswana, I get shortchanged. When I rock up as Zimbabwe, we must negotiate with China, negotiate with America, negotiate with Europe as one block. This is what will drive development. Are we doing that? And by the way, when have you ever seen an American president or European prime minister or a Chinese leader say to the African, you must unite, you must work together? They don't, because it's not in their interest. The Chinese want you to come as Botswana, come as Zimbabwe, come as Senegal. They benefit better that way. I've never seen an American president say, you know, you Africans, you know, I think you can do a better job when you unite. They don't tell you that. Oh, you must be democratic. You must do human rights, which is important, but why don't you tell me to unite with my brothers and sisters? And guess what? They know the value of unity. I've already told you, 1.3 billion Indians, 1.4 billion Chinese. The Americans, you know, go to history. The worst war the Americans fought was not the Second World War. It was the Civil War to keep America together. They bled, they shed blood to keep America together because they know the importance of numbers. Do you realize that California would want to be a country? They would do very well, they'd be maybe number 4, number 5 in the world. Georgia, with its capital in Atlanta, could, but they gave up on being a nation called California, a nation called New York, a nation called Georgia, to create the United States of America as the number 1 in the world, $25 trillion GDP. There's a price to pay for unity. It's not free. When we unite, and now one country called United States of Africa, there'll be one president coming from Togo. In Nigeria, there'll be Minister of Agriculture. Is the top guy. In South Africa, Minister of Tourism. In Zimbabwe, Minister of the Police, these African leaders are not ready to become ministers. I want to be president of starving people. The Chinese have one president that's doing well. The Indians one prime minister, America one president. So why do you need 54 or 55 presidents on the continent? What I'm saying is, a unit is not cheap, it's not free. You must give up on some elements of national sovereignty to embrace continental sovereignty. It's not free. There's no cheap, there's no free lunch. And when we talk about scale, I've talked about Africa, which is 1.4 billion people. There's a new idea called Global Africa, which again is leveraging Pan-Africanism and the diaspora. We don't talk diaspora anymore. We call it Global Africa. The Indians, the Africans in the West Indies, they are all of us that together is Global Africa. Why don't we leverage Global Africa? Okay, and I don't even know what the numbers when Global Africa, maybe 2 billion. Can you imagine if somehow we have a framework of doing economics on the basis of Global Africa? And we approach Europe as Global Africa. We approach America as Global Africa. We approach the Chinese as Global Africa. I'm talking development, not democracy. I love democracy. I keep saying that because I say, oh, he's a Chinese agent. No, I love democracy, right. But I also love development. Global Africa. Another term.
1 minute.
Okay, another term is Global South. Why don't we work as Global South? This now brings in India and China on our part. I'm very upset that the Iranian president was killed in an American, helicopter designed in 1968, bought in 1979. Why don't we build our helicopters in Egypt for the Global South, in China for the Global South? By the way, when you build a helicopter for the Global South, the market is there. He should have been in a Chinese helicopter or a Russian helicopter or his own helicopter. Scale comes from the Global South. And also it's also called global majority. I'm closing. So what has worked? We must give ourselves a bit of credit. In South Africa, what has worked is the functional separation of powers. I think the judiciary, executive, and legislature are fairly independent. That must be celebrated. Although this is a decision on MK and Zuma, I think it was a political decision by the courts. I'm not very pleased by that one. But generally, the courts are independent. Parliament is very robust. You've seen those debates in that. That is good. Functional separation of powers has gone well. Renewal within a political party coming and going, Mbeki coming and going, Zuma coming and going. In Zimbabwe, we had one man for 37 years. He had to be taken out by a coup d'etat. So I think that renewal in the ANC is a good thing. Yeah? Democracy, coups, Nigeria is now a democracy and all that. The coups in the new coups, again, they make my point. The young people in Burkina Faso and other places are taking over power because democracy has failed to deliver. And I'm not endorsing a coup d'etat. I'm simply saying address the reasons why there's a coup d'etat. Those coup d'etats have been celebrated because people are saying, we've been voting with no choice, voting with no change. Let's do a coup d'etat. We have come a long way. We've done some good work on AI in Mauritius and Rwanda. They got good work around AI. And so there are many stories that are positive on the continent. But I want to say, in order to get democracy and development in Africa, we must link them, identify the requirements for democracy, identify the requirements of development, and then put them together. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. That was very robust in its own right. I have to say, after 20 years or so of researching democracy, I've never heard of it discussed through the language of mathematics before. So I'm stealing that. I'm taking it. Necessary but not sufficient condition. Thank you. I'll use that going forward. But now it's time now for Q&A. So I think this is the most exciting part. We get to share what your thoughts are. So I know that we have some colleagues also online who might have questions for us as well. So I don't know. I think we'll start in the room. So I think what I'll do is take the first round of questions and then we'll have the speakers respond to those. And we'll see how many rounds we can fit in before we have to finish at around 1:30. Okay. So can I ask those of you who do have questions just to raise your hands? There will be a mic that comes around, I think, so that the online audience can hear you. Or, okay, you can just speak. You can just speak. You can speak. Everyone will hear you, but try and be loud if you can. And also, please state your name just so that we know who you are. And try and keep your question fairly short so that we have enough chance for others to ask questions. Okay, so yes, go ahead. You are the first person I see with a hand up.
Morning, everyone. Thank you. Thank you to the speakers. My name is Anthony Kaziboni. I'm from the Center for Social Development in Africa. A question from me. We've spoken about Africa and African development and politicians. I would want to know more the role of the West in development. How do we develop as a continent with the West? I say this within the context of how the West is fueling conflict, particularly in the North and Central regions. Do we need the West?
Is that directed to everyone on the panel?
To all the
all
panelists.
the panel. So maybe I can ask Prof. Hamilton, who was our first speaker, to respond first. Prof, did you hear that question?
I think it's really important to both agree with Professor Mutambara and disagree with him in answer to this question. In one sense, there's something about the Global South and Africa and the NIO and a bloc in opposition to the developed world that we seem to have forgotten in the last 50 years or so. And I think what Prof was saying there around creating a negotiating bloc, if you like, whether it's an African bloc or beyond Africa to a Global South bloc, is an extremely important point. I disagree about the delinking component, but I won't waste our time now around that because I'm sure we'll have opportunity to speak about it again. But in answer to the question, I think that there's, in a sense, it's not so much that we need the West, but that the world is globalized to such an extent that it's not necessarily advantageous to remove ourselves from the West. There is so much learning, whether it's been very unequal learning, very dominating learning, but there's so much learning that's gone on for so long that we need to embrace that, but change the power dynamics, I would say, in answer to that question. And one of the ways in which you can change those power dynamics and keep the West involved in this to your advantage is to be a more powerful negotiator, a more powerful bloc in seeking from the West what is in your interest, what is in our interest in Africa, in the Global South. And then the question becomes how best to do that. And I think it is vital that we act not as little independent entities, but as blocks in the form of BRICS, in the form of Africa, in the form of Global South, whatever have you. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Prof. Let's go to Prof. Okoshi in the room. Do you want to add anything to that, maybe?
Well, I'll just maybe here recommend Samir Amin on delinking. Delinking as an important element in driving development in Africa, with the essence of ensuring that dynamics on the continent respond to internal market needs rather than being extroverted to serve external needs. In a sense, it links up with Arthur Mutambara's observations about the size of the economy. We normally pursue policies without a home market strategy in mind on the continent, on the assumption that the more we are able to transact with the outside world, the better for us in developmental terms. And it has simply, over the last 60 years, amounted to jumping on the same spot and jumping even harder each time, hoping to make a break, which never comes. So that's what I would and the theory that has been developed around that, the tension between autochthony and extraversion has been mostly, I think, in my view, advanced by Samir Amin in his work on delinking and others too. Whilst I still have the floor, let me also say that a lot of the points which Arthur Mutambara made resonate with me, but two things for the sake of debate. I am really very hesitant nowadays to even claim that China is not democratic. I am very hesitant. And if you won't call me a communist, it's okay. Why am I hesitant? Because I've also seen how so-called democracies, including mature and advanced democracies, have not only somersaulted, but also overturned everything that you would define as democratic. Imagine if the police to remove students and professors, arrest them for protesting, And then on the other hand, you mount a podium and say that, well, there's no freedom of speech in Iran. Excuse me, please. Calm down. As far as I'm concerned, based on my readings on China, they run a system of internal democracy within the Communist Party. And people who have studied this, not necessarily Chinese, have indicated this. There is not one universal model of democracy. British democracy is different from American democracy. They have a monarch as head of state. The American Constitution was built on the idea that monarchy is totally out and power is with Congress. And you take every so-called democracy around the world, you will find that actually there is a difference that speaks to the historical context within which they were born. In the case of Africa, what we have been doing and doing very badly is trying to mimic other people. We import models. We're not looking at our history, and you are completely right in that regard. And if you do not have a roadmap of where you want to go, and you begin to try to fly drones all over the place, you're going to get into a crash. And that's why repeatedly we are going back to square one, always starting afresh, always trying to get it right. And we therefore need to step back. Where do we want to be, as Arthur said, in the next 50 years as a continent? Nobody owes us a living. Where do we want to be? On the basis of where do we want to be, how do we organize ourselves to get there? On the basis of an organizational plan, how do we distribute responsibilities, reciprocal, power and accountability, and so on and so forth. And then we can call it Afrocracy if we like. Let the rest of the world follow us.
Yeah. You actually answered one of my questions already in what you were saying there. So thanks. Tick. Prof, do you mind if we park it? Because then you might get more responses from more questions. Unless it's quick.
Very, very quick.
Okay, very quick.
I share your views on China, on democracy, but I wanted just to make sure that those who believe that China is really democracy can take the argument for democracy. But otherwise, I share with you on democracy. Secondly, we need the West, but on our own terms. I share Professor Lawrence's view. We need everybody, but how do you approach the West? When I say AI is coming out of San Francisco. How can you do AI without the West? But the issue is, can you use AI to solve your own problems? So we need the West, but we need to work with them on our terms. We need to work with everybody, but on our terms. Delinking, please don't misunderstand me. Delinking is for analysis. When you execute, they're all interconnected. But for you to understand what's going on, delink, analyze, put them back together.
I hear you. Thanks, Prof. Okay, so I think we had another hand here. Prof Moore wanted to ask a question, I think. Or was it make a comment? Somebody did?
Or somebody before me.
Yes, no, I think you were next in my.
Well, I'm David Moore. I'm trying to be a retired
Not
professor, but the West is in crisis. This is not only a crisis in Africa, that's a big thing to remember. There's a very interesting article by Benjamin Fogel, I think, in the New Statesman this weekend. He's Brazilian, South African, been in South Africa for quite a while. Very interesting about how South Africa's democracy is in the same crisis. We have ultra-rightists, we have identitarian politics, it's a mess, the whole world. Now, and that's another question. So we're not alone. And that kind of parks the question of what can the West do to one side, I guess, because Lawrence, at the end you talked about we have to decide on the ends and then we get the means to get there. Maybe that kind of links in with the delinking and development. But I think these ends are always going to be really different. And perhaps, to use a word that I generally don't like using, culturally determined. So that's a big issue, and it kind of gets back to Isaiah Berlin's value pluralism and so on. Lawrence. But Lawrence, you're a scholar of Machiavelli and a scholar of Sen. What could Machiavelli teach Sen, and what could and vice versa? What could Sen teach Machiavelli about development? Adebayo, I think especially your last comments are really interesting, is what are our histories? And I've been thinking for a long time, what was an African mode of production? And how has it been changed? How does that change culture, development, democracy, all of these failures amidst some actually fascinating technological developments that Arthur could talk about, I guess. So I guess we really have to go back into what was a pre-colonial Africa. Berlin Conference ruined it, all of that sort of stuff. But there's got to be something there. There's something there that historically, you go back in the history of China, you go back in the history of India, where, of course, these things get touched into a far-right discourse, which is what Modi is all about. So the history can be misused and used, well, I don't know if you could go a bit further on that. How did China get beyond warlordism? It was war. There was invasions by Japan. India, Karl Marx talked about India in the 1850s. He said, well, capitalism destroys a society, but it might create something interesting. He predicted the rise of Indian bourgeoisie. It took him 150 years, 200 years to get there, but they're kind of there. And again, with extraordinary degrees of inequality and with the hangover of feudalism and so on. So Arthur, when you were a student, you were a Marxist-Leninist. Maybe you still are. I think the last public event you were at was back in 2008 when the GNU was coming into to Zimbabwe, and you were going to become deputy president. And he said, "I am a communist," on the stage there at the theater. So how does a Marxist change from what you were thinking as a student leader and back in 2008? How do you, using those ideas, talk about technology and development? Because technology, mode of production, means production, and so on. That's the base. You're getting it there. What would you sacrifice now to get a united Africa? So there must be blood spilled, or there was in the United States. If you look back to July 2021 in KZN, chances of united Africa or united South Africa don't look that great. You look at now the divisions within ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, it looks like the fractions are kind of hanging over there. So what are the sacrifices that you would ask Africans to make? Not just presidents who might become a minister of transport, but take it one step further. Sorry, I went on for a long time. You got a minute each to answer.
Yeah, you have a minute each, but those are really good questions. So, we can't fault you there. So, Prof. Hamilton, would you be able to respond to that in 1 minute? Let's see if that's possible.
Wow, yeah, that'll be demanding. 2 parts to your question, ends and means. So very quickly, I don't think they map on comprehensively or neatly onto the distinction or the delinking that the Prof was talking about earlier, partly because the ends from this sort of perspective are not technical ends. and they require democracy. So democracy is a necessary condition for development. And very quickly, that's because even to get development off the ground, you've got to deal with people's actual needs and preferences in context. And so democracy is a necessary condition for development, because you can't, as the history of Mao Zedong and others will indicate very quickly, you can't simply develop your programs in abstraction. However well developed they are, you can't simply develop them in abstraction from the actual existing needs and interests of the populace on the ground. So that's how I would answer that question, and links very well actually to your question around Machiavelli and Sen. Machiavelli's simple argument was that the function of the leader, the function of what he called the prince, and the prince can be a single individual, a group of aristocrats, or in his later work, something much more democratic, is the function of the prince is to save the state, is to maintain the state. And to maintain the state requires freedom. And freedom is obtained via a constant conflict between the elites and the plebeians. This constant conflict requires the kind of thing Sen has in mind, but he doesn't actually see it in terms of conflict. He has a much more consensual view of this process, but I see it much more in terms of conflict. But in order for that conflict to obtain, you have to enable a situation, and again, this is where democracy comes in, you have to enable a situation, an institutional arrangement, such that the plebeians' needs and interests can, in some instances, trump the desire of the elites to dominate, even if it means knocking over their 5-year, 10-year, 30-year plan.
Thanks very much, Prof. Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Prof. Olukushi then. I mean, we've got a minute and a half maybe each. Let me give you 30 seconds more.
Yeah, no, I'll be very brief. I think it's important for us to also start from the premise that democracy, however we define it, is part of the broad consciousness of all people. And there is no people anywhere in history that would choose to live under authoritarian forms of government. If by democracy we understand modes and patterns of inclusion and participation, we've had in pre-colonial Africa, as documented to date, various types of participation and inclusion experimented. You made mention, Chair, of constitutions that actually predated the Magna Carta in what is today Mali. You make reference to the ways in which royal power was managed, sometimes even curtailed in different contexts. So that actually it's impossible to talk of one model, even in pre-colonial Africa, of democratization. There was a variety of systems. In the far extreme of that spectrum, you'd have highly centralized systems with methods of control of the use of power, including a demand on the chief to commit suicide if they violated certain codes. And at the other end, you would have what was wrongly referred to by earlier historians as so-called acephalous societies, or societies that were supposedly stateless, but actually had important authority structures and processes, organized, for example, according to chiefly authority, age grades, gender, and so on and so forth, and each playing its role on the basis of a written or unwritten code of understanding that made governance possible. For those who might want to look at the way in which participation and consent was mobilized in that early period, you might want to look at the book of Nur al-Kali on the Kanem Borno Empire, look at the example of the Kwararafa kingdoms in what is Central Sudan, and look also at Basil Davidson. He did quite a lot of work actually around colonialism and the state of nation-statism, for example, going back to the organization of pre-colonial African formations. Or if you want to watch his The Africans, I think, which was a series for BBC, if I'm not mistaken, a 3-part series that also goes from ancient African history into the period leading to the onset of colonialism.
Thank you so much, Prof. Prof, you have the last word here since we've reached the end of the session. So I'm going to leave it to you to finish up, and then we'll break. And then if there are further questions, we'll just take them to the eats. There's some refreshments at the back there, so we can continue talking afterwards, but we do have to finish and stick to time as much as possible. So Prof, the last word.
Yeah, just building on what has been said here, it's important that we leverage our history, our culture, our value system, in addition to borrowing from others. You know, Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew explains it this way. I looked at China and I took what I liked from China. I rejected some stuff. I looked at America, I borrowed what I wanted from America, I rejected some stuff. I looked at myself in Singapore and then I built the Singaporean model. So the African must do the same. Borrow from the Chinese, reject some Chinese elements, borrow from the West, then look at ourselves, our own history, our own values, and then build a purely African economic model. So that history is important, that Ubuntu as a value system. Why don't we leverage that? It's different from what the Japanese do and the Europeans. I am because we are because I am. Why don't we incorporate these psychology and philosophies in our business models and so on? So we must build an African model that leverages the African history and values. Marxism-Leninism, the values and principles of Marx and Lenin are still very important today. But they've been refined over time. We've seen failures and successes. I can't call myself a Marxist-Leninist because I know more than Marx and Lenin. I've seen the internet. I've seen artificial. How can I say Marxist-Leninist? I'm a professor of rocket science. Marx didn't know anything about AI. So how can I name myself after him? Anyway, I'll leverage Marx. I'll learn from Lenin, but I won't call myself after them. Yeah, I will learn from them, but I also teach them 1 or 2 if they were to arise from their graves. There is also now the means of technology, means of production, yeah? Means of technology is a major addition to the framework of analysis that we should do. Now, in terms of integration, what can individuals sacrifice? By the way, the leaders are individuals. So the individuals also aspire to become a president. So when you abolish the presidency in Malawi, when you abolish the presidency in South Africa, the individual will say, no, but what about me and my ambitions? You know? So even they, the individuals are also affected by this issue of the cost of integration. The major thing I can tell you which individuals must lose is a mindset. Your commitment to the nation must be replaced by your commitment to the region. Your commitment to the country must be replaced by your commitment to the continent. You must be able to say, I'm an African first, a citizen of SADC second, South African third. How many South Africans can say that? I'm number 3 South African.
Yeah.
Number 1, I'm an African. Number 2, I'm a member of SADC. Right now, as we speak, how many of you in here can sing the AU anthem? Do you even know it exists? How many of you can sing the SADC anthem? But of course, you can sing the South African anthem, Zimbabwean anthem. You know, Noam Chomsky calls it irrational jingoism. He says, why should I care if my home team wins? You know, people, I support Manchester, I support South Africa, I support Malawi. Why should I care if my home country wins? I don't even know one on the team. When you support your home team, you are being trained to support the nation when it goes to war. You're being bottlenecked into the nation states. We must rise above the nation state and embrace the region. We must rise above the nation and embrace the continent. Final word. I know you say, I'm a superstar academic, I'm a superstar lawyer, I'm a superstar businessman. You are a superstar nothing. You'll never be respected as an African until Africa is done well as a continent. You'll never be respected as a South African as long as we have Alexandria and poverty in Soweto and deep slots. You and I have a duty and obligation to fix Africa, to fix South Africa. All the ideas we've discussed today are important for you to be respected. I've experienced it. I go to the World Economic Forum, I talk loud. And they say, where are you from? I refuse to answer. I tell them, I'm coming from MIT, McKinsey. No, which country? I refuse to answer. I describe myself in my superstardom. Eventually I say, I'm from Zimbabwe. They're like, oh, come on. If you are that smart, how come your country is messed up? If you are that smart, how come there's cholera in Iran? Shame on you, Mtambara. You are no rock star. Your rock star status will be undermined by the bankruptcy of your country. Your rock star status will be diminished by the bankruptcy of Africa. And that applies to global Africa as well. No one will respect Obama or Oprah Winfrey as long as the ghetto is black. As long as 1/3 of young black males in America are in prison, parole, or probation. Shame on you, Obama, shame on you, Oprah Winfrey. You will never be respected unless and until the black person is flourishing globally.
I think that's the perfect way to end that, actually. Me now to say thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you once again for really eloquent and really thought-provoking speeches from everyone here. Prof. Hamilton, Prof. Olukoshi, Prof. Mutambara, thank you so much for sharing your information, sharing with us information, but also your thoughts on these topics that are not easy actually to interrogate. But also thank you to all of those who are here in the audience who listened to all of this. So I also must acknowledge somebody from the Embassy of Morocco who also arrived here as well. So thank you for being here. Thank you again to our other listeners, French and Spain as well. And then lastly, thank you to Dr. Teller for arranging this event. We should have more of these, don't you think? An hour and a half is not enough. We need 2 days to discuss democracy and development, really. So let's see if we can work on that. Okay, but thank you, everyone. Everyone, there is food at the back. Please stick around and have something to eat and carry on the conversation, which has been so fantastic already. And thank you once again to our speakers. One more round of applause, please.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.